He was accused of murder, but he was innocent and the truth took too long. In a courtroom in St. Louis, Missouri, a thin, downcast man listened to his sentence as if silently collapsing. Daniel Scott, 29, a college librarian, sat motionless as the judge read the second-degree murder conviction. Television cameras captured every second of his neutral expression, but his eyes betrayed something greater: despair, disbelief, exhaustion. His mother, Joan, huddled in the back row of the audience bench, her hands trembling and her face buried in a worn handkerchief. The prosecutor seemed satisfied, the jury indifferent. Outside, the crowd of reporters, onlookers, and activists cheered justice as if an evil had been defeated. Sensational headlines popped up in real time. Campus monster convicted, Dawn killer sentenced. It was a public catharsis of relief, of exultation, of victory against an evil everyone believed had been resolved. But deep inside Daniel's cell, the silence was complete. No real evidence, no motive, no chance for a full defense. The sound of the iron door closing echoed with the weight of a life being forcibly sealed away. But that was just the beginning of the story that would steal the next 21 years from me. Daniel Scott woke up every day at 6:30 a.m. in Kansas City, Missouri, without an alarm clock. The smell of coffee brewed by his mother filled the narrow hallway of the house where he lived with his older brother. He wore the same white sneakers and rode his bike through the neighborhood, crossing the streets still damp in the morning. The destination was always the same, the UMKC University Library. There, he was the invisible man among endless shelves. At 29, Daniel wasn't known for his great accomplishments, but he was remembered for small details: the polite way he said "excuse me," the way he cleaned his glasses before serving someone. His clothes were understated plain shirts, worn jeans, a wool coat he'd inherited from his father. His world was made of silence, marked pages, and punctual schedules. Students knew him more by his nod than by his name. After work, he'd cycle back, listening to instrumental music on old braided cord headphones. He'd pass the same corner coffee shop where he'd buy an apple pie once a week. When he got home, he'd go straight upstairs to his room, where he'd organize his VHS tape collection alphabetically. On Sundays, he'd visit his father's grave with his mother. On holidays, he'd read detective novels with a notebook by his side. Daniel was a homebody, reserved and averse to noise. His brother Evan said he seemed to have stepped out of another decade, perhaps the 1950s. Such was his nostalgia and restrained manner. He never got into fights, never went to college parties, never got drunk. His idea of rebellion was buying a new book before the end of the month. This was a man everyone would later judge without batting an eye. His mother, Joan, treated him like a piece of glass. She used to slip notes into his lunch boxes: "Take care, my boy." There was a kind of silence between them that required no explanation. Since his father's death, Daniel had become the center of the household, though he never assumed that role. He shopped, changed light bulbs, fixed the heater, and yet he always kept to himself. To outsiders, Daniel was simply ordinary, neither brilliant nor dull, neither overly friendly nor rude. He moved through the world without leaving it untouched, like a pebble rounded by a steady river. He was the kind of man few people notice, but everyone expects to be there when they need him, a silent anchor in a sea of voices. He loved old cinema, especially film noir. He found the idea of silent injustices, lonely detectives, and persecuted innocence fascinating. Perhaps, unknowingly, he was preparing for his own fate. He collected old scripts, made notes on soundtracks, recited lines from memory in his notebooks. He collected quotes about truth, doubt, and guilt. It was a pastime, not a warning. At the library, he was loved by some colleagues and ignored by others. He had a methodical routine: organizing shelves, responding to student requests, restoring damaged books. He was never late. He never missed a class without notice. In 6 years, he took only 2 days off, one for a fever, the other to attend a distant cousin's funeral. He was the kind of employee the university forgot about until the day he was missed. Daniel hadn't dated in years. After a disappointment in high school, he began to doubt his own ability to open up. He believed it was better to be lonely than to be misunderstood. He had a library friend, Megan, who sometimes had lunch with him, but it never went beyond that. He preferred the company of books that didn't judge him. Books never require explanations. The house where he lived was simple, made of whitewood with a small porch and an unkempt garden. The furniture was still the same as his father's. The television was old, but it worked. There were portraits on the walls, most of them in black and white. Life there was calm, predictable, even monotonous, and Daniel liked it that way. Any variation caused him a slight anxiety. In his drawer was an acceptance letter for an archival science program in Chicago. He never responded. He was afraid to leave and leave his mother alone. He was afraid to leave what he knew. His world was small, but it was safe, and he preferred security to adventure. Perhaps that's why no one believed him when they accused him of a brutal crime. There was something about Daniel that reminded me of certain tragic characters, those who fall not because of their actions, but because they were in the wrong place. He was solitary, yes, but never cruel. He was introspective, but never dark, and it was precisely this neutral profile that allowed others to fill him with their own assumptions. In a world so quick to judge, his stillness became suspect. His days were marked by small gestures, sorting books to be returned, adjusting the brim of his cap, carefully choosing a bookmark. He wrote letters to himself, reflecting on what he wanted to change. But they were timid changes, smiling more, making friends, leaving the house. Major revolutions were never part of his plan until life decided for him. Daniel was invisible to the city, but soon he would be seen by everyone on television, in newspapers, in headlines of violent crimes. He would become a news story, a poster boy, the target of cruel comments, and all this without having done anything. He would be remembered not for who he was, but for what others decided he was. The silence, now, was beginning to weigh heavily. Some would later say he looked strange. Others would claim he was odd, but harmless. No one said he was dangerous until it was convenient. What made him suspicious wasn't what he'd done, but what he looked like, and in a society eager for answers, any hint of difference becomes evidence. That's how the invisible became the villain. But Daniel's routine was about to be interrupted by an unexpected connection. In the early morning hours of February 12, 2003, the body of a young woman was found near the south parking lot of the UMKC campus. She was lying face down, with stab wounds to her back and visible signs of a struggle. The area was partially lit by distant streetlights, and the nearest security camera captured images distorted by raindrops. Police were called by a security guard on routine patrol. Within an hour, the perimeter was cordoned off and floodlights were on. The victim's name was Lauren Price, a 22-year-old psychology student active in university projects. Her blonde hair was tied back with a pin, her backpack open, and a pair of sneakers lying nearby. The press arrived before the forensic examination was even finished. The first assumptions were already circulating: sexual assault, attempted robbery, random crime. The campus, which until then had been considered safe, plunged into panic. A culprit needed to be identified quickly. The next day, the university issued a statement promising full cooperation with the investigation. Professors wept in class and colleagues held candlelight vigils. The young woman's mother appeared on local television begging for justice with a trembling voice. Meanwhile, police analyzed all the cameras in the area. A silver car was spotted passing by the scene 3 times within 30 minutes. The car's model, an older sedan with a damaged taillight. A similar vehicle was parked in front of Daniel Scott's house. It was the car he'd inherited from his father. With a discreet crack in the rear window, the coincidence was enough to raise an alarm. A neighbor, curious to see police activity, decided to help. He said he'd seen Daniel out at night a few days earlier. Nothing confirmed, but enough to fuel suspicion. 2 detectives knocked on the Scott's door late in the afternoon. They said they wanted to talk. They were cordial, smiling, almost too kind. Daniel, with no reason to fear, welcomed them. He sat at the kitchen table, still holding his mug of tea. He agreed to go to the police station to answer a few questions. He didn't bring a lawyer. He hadn't even imagined needing one. He believed in the logic of the world he knew. In the interrogation room, the temperature seemed cooler, the lights were bright, and the digital clock on the wall wasn't keeping time correctly. The questions started out simple: where he was the night before, what he knew about Lauren, if he'd ever seen her on campus. Then they became more incisive. Why was his car in the photos? Did he know anyone who wanted to hurt Lauren? Had he ever had problems with women? Daniel answered everything calmly. His expression was one of exhaustion, not fear. He said that, on the night of the crime, He was at home reading a detective novel and then went to bed early. His brother confirmed this, but the detectives insisted. They said his speech was too rehearsed, that the fact that he was so calm seemed suspicious. They began to force a narrative before even piecing together a coherent puzzle. After 3 hours, they asked him to sign a document summarizing his testimony. Daniel hesitated, but relented. It was then that they told him they needed his cell phone and computer, and his car. It would only be for analysis. He wasn't charged yet, they said. It was just part of a procedure. When he realized it, they'd already taken all his belongings. The house was empty. His trust, too. Meanwhile, the university was quickly distancing itself from its employee. The dean gave an interview stating that no one involved in the investigation would remain active at the institution. In the cafeteria, students whispered. Theories involving Daniel's name were already circulating in the student newspaper. Social media was abuzz with montages, memes, and accusations. The public trial had begun well before the court. 2 days later, Daniel was called back to the police station. He thought it was just to retrieve his belongings, but upon arriving, he was informed that he would be held in preventive detention pending further investigation. Still without a lawyer, still unable to understand what was happening, he spent the night in the police cell. Hearing the sharp click of the bars closing behind him for the first time, Evan tried to intervene, but was ignored. Joan called friends, neighbors, churches. No one knew what to do. The family had never dealt with the police before, nor did they know where to begin. The next day, the pretrial detention became a formal arrest. The allegation, sufficient evidence to support direct suspicion, the car and the images, the lack of an external alibi, the silence that was now interpreted as guilt. The local newspaper ran the headline, "Homicide suspect is university librarian." Daniel's old, blurry photo appeared against a dark background. The text provided no details about the lack of concrete evidence, no mention of the fact that other leads were being ignored. The public wanted answers, and Daniel, silently, seemed to fit the role of unlikely villain well. In prison, he still believed everything would be cleared up soon, that a DNA test would prove his innocence, that witnesses would emerge, that logic would prevail. But logic, in the justice system, often loses out to fear or haste. Lauren Price's case needed a solution, and the solution needed a face. Daniel turned his back, even though he had never approached her. In less than a week, Daniel Scott went from a low-key librarian to a name mentioned across the state. Newspapers were now calling him a possible attacker. The prosecutor used words like vicious, manipulative, and cold. None of them made sense to anyone who knew him, but they made sense to those who needed a villain to alleviate collective fear. It was the beginning of a perverse cycle, but he still had no idea how deeply this gear could crush his life. From the beginning, the investigation into Lauren Price's case was marked by haste and carelessness. Local police, under enormous pressure from the community and the media, wanted a quick suspect. Daniel Scott, with his reserved profile and a car similar to the one in the blurred images, became the perfect target. No real effort was made to explore other lines of inquiry. Evidence was collected haphazardly, without clear preservation criteria. The police reports contained glaring gaps, conflicting times, ignored witnesses, poorly cataloged traces. A forensic technician pointed out that some crime scene photos were compromised by poor lighting, but none of that mattered. For the chief of police, Daniel was already guilty even before there was any evidence. The investigation continued to confirm a narrative, not to uncover the truth. The public defender assigned to Daniel seemed overwhelmed and disinterested in their first meetings. He talked more about plea bargains than about evidence or defense strategies. "It's better to admit something than to face a 30-year sentence," he said, almost as a warning. Daniel, confused, refused to admit to anything he hadn't done. But with each conversation, he felt he was alone in this battle. The security cameras used as evidence were nearly useless. The footage was grainy, poorly positioned, and didn't even show who was driving the car. Even so, the prosecutor presented the footage as if it were a visual confession. There were no fingerprints of Daniel at the scene. There was no object linking him to the victim. Still, the official narrative was solidified. A key witness, a campus security guard, had initially said he didn't recognize Daniel. However, after hours of guidance from the police, his story changed. He began stating that he thought he saw A man with short brown hair, that not a generic description. That could have applied to hundreds of people, but for the prosecution, that was enough. Media pressure influenced every step of the process. Headlines suggested that the police were one step closer to arresting the campus killer. Reporters surrounded the police station, creating an atmosphere of urgency and sensationalism. Public opinion was against Daniel from the start. Any doubt in his favor was seen as an attempt to obstruct justice. When the lawyer tried to request new DNA testing, he was denied. The claim? Unnecessary costs and risk of contamination of existing samples. Daniel felt his voice was worthless. Every request for an explanation was met with phrases like trust, the system, but the system had already chosen its path, and he was the scapegoat. The police station treated Daniel as guilty from day one. The detectives made this clear in the tone of their questions. "Are you going to confess now, or would you rather wait and tell the court?" they asked, as if innocence were impossible. He was beginning to understand that he wasn't being listened to. Every detail of his daily life was distorted to fit a cruel narrative. Evan tried to hire a private attorney, but the costs were exorbitant. They sold the family car to pay for an independent analysis of the footage. The result? The recordings were inconclusive, but this report was never accepted in the lawsuit. On the grounds that the expert was not impartial, the truth was slowly being buried. The investigation was filled with pages of inconsistencies. Wrong dates, duplicate reports, even a changed name, but no one seemed to care. The important thing was a quick conclusion. The prosecutor said in interviews, "We have clear evidence." But the evidence was merely supposition and fragile interpretations. Daniel felt like he was being crushed by a never-ending machine. Joan, his mother, tried to send letters to the newspapers explaining who her son was. No one wanted to publish them. The monster narrative was more lucrative. Every day, Daniel saw his face plastered across the headlines and didn't recognize himself. It was as if they were inventing a cold, calculating, dangerous character and assigning him that role. The defense didn't have full access to the records for weeks. By the time they did, hearings had already been scheduled and decisions made. Time was working against Daniel. The witnesses in his favor were discredited, labeled biased or misinformed. No one seemed willing to hear his version. Innocence, there, was worthless. Daniel's first official statement was edited by the police. Sections were cut, pauses were removed, and the context was distorted. When shown, he appeared cold and evasive, when in fact he was just nervous. The video circulated in the news, reinforcing the image of a man without remorse. Every time Daniel looked at the detectives, he realized the decision had already been made. The trial would be just a ritual to legitimize the conviction. It didn't matter what he said, how he said it, or if there were any other clues. He was the convenient culprit, and no one seemed willing to question that. But the worst was yet to come. The psychological pressure that would almost make him lose his sanity. What began as an informal interrogation quickly turned into an emotionally draining session. Daniel was taken back to the police station under the pretext of clarifying details. They didn't notify his family. They didn't notify his lawyer. They put him in a windowless room with fluorescent light blaring overhead. There, time dissolved between questions, accusations, and calculated silences. The invisible collapse had begun. For the first few hours, the detectives still feigned cordiality. "We're here to help you, Daniel," they said, their tone rising. With each hesitant response, the pauses grew longer, the repetitions more exhausting. "Why don't you remember exactly what time you went to sleep? Are you sure you were alone? Did you know she was stabbed in the back?" Daniel denied everything, but they no longer knew what he was saying. The technique used was that of exhaustion, time deprivation, mental confusion, alternating between promises and threats. When Daniel said he needed a lawyer, the officers would deflect the subject. "You don't want to look guilty, do you? Or who needs a lawyer when you have nothing to hide?" The pressure didn't just come from the words, it came from the shortness of breath, the stifling environment, and the growing fatigue. After 7 hours, without food, thirsty, and with a headache, Daniel began to relent. They told him that if he confessed, he could serve a reduced sentence. They told him he might not even be arrested if he cooperated. They told him that everyone makes mistakes and that his family would understand. Daniel's mind began to fail. He was confused, his body trembling, his vision blurred, and then they placed a piece of paper in front of him. It was a written confession, written by the police, full of language Daniel never used. "I was angry, One part read, "I didn't want to hurt her, just scare her." Daniel could barely read it. He was told to sign quickly and rest. He signed. For the first time in his life, he signed something he didn't understand. The pen slipped from his hand. A piercing silence filled the room. This confession became the basis of the prosecution, even without physical evidence. Even without any consistency, it was presented as a voluntary statement. The prosecutor displayed the paper in court as if it were gold, the accused's own words. He repeated, the context, the circumstances, and the emotional state were ignored. It was too convenient to question. Forensics didn't find Daniel's DNA at the scene, but they did find a drop of blood that wasn't the victim's and wasn't his. This information was omitted from the initial indictment. They claimed marginal relevance. The murder weapon was never found. It was believed to be a regular knife, and coincidentally, Daniel had a similar one at home. That was enough for the prosecution. In addition to the confession, they used Daniel's T-shirt taken from his home, which allegedly contained a dark stain. The report, however, was inconclusive. It could have been coffee, paint, or dried blood. Even so, the piece was displayed in court as symbolic evidence. No one questioned it. No one challenged the logic. The theater of guilt was set. Joan, upon hearing the word confession, nearly fainted. Her son was too sincere even for white lies. It made no sense. He would only sign this if he was scared, she said, her voice breaking. But no one listened to her. In court, mothers are not reliable sources. They are just mothers. And mothers, according to the prosecution, always believe their children are innocent. The judge allowed the confession video to be shown, even after the defense claimed coercion. In the video, Daniel appears spaced out, sweating, with a shaky voice. He answers in monosyllables. At times, he doesn't even understand the questions. The jury, however, watched it as a spectacle. His body language was interpreted as coldness. There was no room for doubt. When Daniel tried to explain after signing under duress, no one believed him. Why would he confess to something he didn't do? They asked. The prosecution reversed the logic. They used his desperation as a weapon against him. It was as if his very survival served as evidence. His fear of destruction became evidence of guilt. The trap was complete. The defense attempted to present psychological reports about coercion and emotional vulnerability. They were disregarded. The prosecutor said that no one is forced to confess without reason. Emotional reality was denied in the name of a fabricated rationale. Daniel saw his life crumble with each line read aloud in court. In pretrial detention, he spent days in silence. He replayed the interrogation scene in his mind, trying to understand where he had lost control. He wrote down everything he remembered, but his memories were already blurry. He had nightmares about detectives' voices, white lights, and his pen slipping in his hand. He was trapped both outside and inside himself. Joan began visiting her son more frequently, even though she couldn't touch him during their meetings. She brought newspaper clippings with similar allegations of false confessions. Daniel read them, but didn't react. His gaze fixed, his body hunched, the silence deepened. Little by little, hope faded. The truth seemed to no longer matter. But something began to bother even some of his cellmates. Why would that man, so calm and so devoid of hate, be there for such a brutal crime? During the evidentiary phase, witnesses began to take the stand. The first was the victim's roommate, who testified that Lauren was afraid to walk alone at night. He said she always avoided the south parking lot, but the victim was found right there. The question lingered. What had led her to that spot that early morning? The prosecution ignored it. A campus security guard testified that he saw a thin man, maybe white, maybe Hispanic, running from the crime scene. He couldn't clearly state his height, age, or clothing. In his initial statements, he said he didn't recognize Daniel. In court, he hesitated. It could have been him. I think so. This doubt should have weakened the prosecution, but it was used as a reinforcement. A neighbor on campus reported hearing screams around 8 a.m. Another resident in the area claimed to have heard screams at 4:45 a.m. The coroner, in turn, placed the time of death between 4:30 and 5 a.m. The accounts clashed, but no investigation delved into these contradictions. They preferred to stick with the version most convenient to the prosecution's timeline. A friend of the victim testified that Lauren had recently mentioned being followed by someone. The police didn't investigate this information. This witness was quickly dismissed as if her statement were irrelevant. The defense attorney tried to explore her case, but was interrupted several times. The judge seemed impatient with any deviation from the prosecution. A cafeteria worker claimed to have seen Daniel in the library at 4:20 a.m. In one of the break rooms, he claimed he passed him on his way to his morning shift. This testimony was completely dismissed by the prosecution. There's no way to confirm this statement, they claimed, even without having attempted to retrieve images from the library. There was also testimony from a woman who swore she saw a tall, black man wearing a hooded sweatshirt crossing the campus that same morning. She called the police on the day of the crime. Her account was left out of the case. The prosecution argued that there was no direct connection to the case. The defense attempted to recover this testimony, but was unsuccessful. During the trial, an ex-girlfriend of Daniel's was called to testify about his temperament. She claimed he was never violent, just introspective and reserved. The prosecution undermined her, insinuating that she didn't really know Daniel. The jury seemed to absorb the insinuation more than the actual content of the statement. The victim's brother, visibly shaken, declared that everything pointed to Daniel, but when questioned by the defense, he couldn't say what actual evidence supported this opinion. He simply said he felt. This testimony moved the jury, but it didn't provide any concrete evidence. The force of emotion overrode the logic of the case. A forensic expert hired by the prosecution admitted during cross-examination that the type of knife used could have come from any regular store. This contradicted the prosecutor's attempt to link the object found in Daniel's home to the crime. Even so, the knife was displayed as symbolic evidence and made a visual impact in the courtroom. Another inconsistency emerged with the report on the victim's messages. Lauren's cell phone contained records of anonymous threats received days earlier. The police never investigated the number. The defense attorney requested a new forensic report, which was denied. The argument, it's not relevant to the case at hand. Another clue ignored. During the trial, Daniel's mother was called as a character witness. She described her son as a calm child, afraid of horror movies, and kind to animals. She cried as she said she couldn't imagine Daniel hurting anyone. The prosecutor asked, "Did you watch him every night?" The audience murmured. The goal was to discredit her. Another glaring error arose when a police officer mistakenly revealed that there were other suspects early in the investigation. The prosecution requested that the statement be disregarded. The judge granted it. The defense protested, but lost. The jury was instructed to ignore the statement. In effect, the damage had already been done for both sides. Some witnesses seemed rehearsed. They used similar phrases, hesitated on the same points, and provided unnecessary details the defense noticed but had little time to explore them. The trial schedule was rushed. It was as if everything had already been predetermined. Conflicting versions were treated as noise, not warnings, with each new testimony. Daniel felt the weight of a play in progress. The story was told as if it had already been written, and he was just the actor thrust into the role of villain. The doubts were evident, but no one wanted to see them. No one wanted to delay the show. It was easier to pretend everything made sense. But while the court continued with its version, outside of it, Daniel's family began to fall apart. In prison, Daniel began to lose track of time. The days repeated themselves between bars. Muffled noises and tasteless meals. The nights were worse. The rattle of locks, distant shouts. The heavy footsteps of the guards. He tried to sleep with a thin sheet that didn't cover the chill in his mind. He mentally replayed every detail of the night of the crime, every movement, every silence. He began writing letters to himself. "Don't forget who you are." One of them read, but with each passing week, it became harder to remember. The cell was too small for any idea of a future. When he tried to talk to other inmates, he felt strange, out of place. He seemed to belong nowhere. The world outside the prison no longer recognized him. Inside, he was just another number. Joan, his mother, aged 10 years in just a few months. He stopped sleeping properly, developed hypertension, and spent the day in silence. The house, once full of small rituals, was now a place where time stood still. She kept Daniel's room pristine, as if he would return at any moment. She washed his clothes, folded his books, and organized his drawers with care. His brother, Evan, lost his job trying to handle the situation. He missed interviews, spent time looking for lawyers, and tried to sell the family car. He called radio stations, newspapers, and support groups. Few responded. Most had already bought the official version. Daniel was to blame, period. Evan began sleeping on the couch with the TV on, avoiding the silence of the walls. The church the family attended began to shun them. Some members stopped greeting them at the grocery store. Others changed sidewalks. Shame began to seep into the details of daily life. Joan tried to attend church, but was ignored by those who had previously invited her to afternoon tea. The name Sky had become a burden, a symbol of tragedy and suspicion. Daniel began to lose weight. His face thinned. Dark circles grew. His skin paled under the harsh light of his cell. The food sickened him. The shared bathroom disgusted him. The sounds of the prison hurt. He wrote little, read less. He spent long periods sitting, staring at a fixed point on the wall. Sometimes he cried silently. Other times, he simply closed his eyes and pretended he wasn't there. The visits were brief and always through glass. Joan carried old photos, newspaper clippings, letters of support from strangers. I was trying to show him there was still hope. Daniel smiled with effort. He said he was fine, that he could handle it, but his voice was no longer firm. The weight of prison was beginning to crush something deeper than his body. Evan tried to organize a petition to reopen the investigation. He walked the streets with clipboards, faced scornful looks, even spit on. Some laughed, others looked away. Few signed. The name Daniel Scott was associated with fear, and fear leaves no room for justice. The truth was hard to sell. Outrage, even harder. Daniel's former library colleagues didn't talk about the case. Some said they didn't know enough. Others simply avoided commenting. The board issued a brief statement saying they would cooperate with the justice system. But internally, everyone wanted to step aside. It was easier to erase his name from the files than to face the scandal. Joan began keeping journals. Each page was a prayer, a vent, a silent cry. She wrote about Daniel as a child, about his dreams, his fears, his small victories. She remembered the day he won a medal at the science fair, the note she wrote when she was 8, saying, "Mommy, I will protect you forever." Now, she felt helpless. Daniel couldn't stand hearing the phrase, "have faith" anymore. For him, faith was a currency that had run out. He saw the walls closing in, the system ignoring him, time being stolen. Anger appeared as nausea, despair as a cold sweat. Fear took the form of routine, and the prison routine was designed to kill you from the inside, a little each day. One morning, after a panic attack, he was taken to the infirmary. He was shaking nonstop, his eyes glazed over. They prescribed tranquilizers. They sent him back to his cell. No psychological support, no real listening. The system only pushed the fragile to the bottom. And Daniel, powerless, no longer reacted. It was as if he were fading away. Evan even reached out to human rights NGOs for help. Some responded with cold forms, others didn't respond at all. The case seemed to have no legal loopholes for re-examination. The injustice, even evident, wasn't enough. It needed to move, scandalize, and go viral. But Daniel's story was too quiet for the headlines. Television replayed the case as a solved drama. Crime films and documentaries used phrases like the killer librarian or the silent monster. Daniel became a character in a twisted script. The family's pain was merely a backdrop. And with each rewatch, hope faded a little more. But there were still those who listened, and soon, one of those people would begin to change the course of everything. From the earliest days of the investigation, local media embraced the story as a spectacle. The Kansas Star headlined campus killer, librarian under suspicion with an old photo of Daniel. His face blurred, eyes downcast. The subhead hinted at cruelty. Did a reserve profile hide a dark side? It was the beginning of a reputational massacre. No doubt, no question. TV stations began circulating images of Daniel entering the police car handcuffed. One reporter even remarked, "The face of calm, but what lies behind it?" Catchphrases replaced facts. Sensationalist comments suggested his coldness was a symptom of psychopathy. Daniel's silence became fuel for absurd hypotheses. The truth was merely an uncomfortable detail. Radio programs opened the door to public debate. Listeners called in indignantly, "How come no one saw this before? I've always been suspicious of these quiet types." Impromptu psychologists analyzed old photos and claimed to see traces of deviance. Without any basis, Daniel's image was molded until it became unrecognizable. The character surpassed the person, and the public's judgment was instantaneous. Social media amplified the lynching. Photos of him with phrases like "silent monster" went viral. Cruel memes associated libraries with crime. UMKC students even made jokes on online forums. Be careful of those who lend too many books. The trivialization of pain turned Daniel into a caricature. It was easier to laugh at him than to look at the injustice. Even serious journalists avoided touching on the wound. More balanced reports were cut by editors. This case is already decided, they said. The few attempts to question the official version were seen as an affront to the victim. The press positioned itself as an ally of justice. But in practice, it helped bury the victim. Neutrality became omission. The prosecutor gave almost daily interviews. He used words like calculating, cold, potentially dangerous. He said the crime was shocking because of its apparent lack of emotion. The cameras loved it. The image of the calm man hiding a monster was marketable, and it sold on every platform. Daniel, on the other hand, had no voice. The defense couldn't get media coverage. When they tried to present weak evidence or investigative errors, they were cut. Lack of evidence. The producer said the story already had a script, and the heroes and villains were already defined. Showing doubt risked ratings, and ratings were the only justice that mattered in newsrooms. Joan wrote letters to newspapers. She requested the right of reply. None were published. She sent emails to radio stations, magazines, and newscasters, only to respond to say the content was inappropriate for the moment. The family's suffering didn't make headlines. The mother's weeping face wasn't as marketable as the image of the calm killer. One of the city's Mo Street columnists wrote, "Even if he didn't do it, he's the kind of person who could." The phrase circulated for weeks, became a bumper sticker, became an argument. Moral judgment became detached from the facts. Daniel became a symbol of collective fear. He was proof that evil could live next door. The innocent man now needed to prove he wasn't the villain he'd imagined. Public opinion pressed for an exemplary conviction. Protests organized by the victim's family demanded justice. Posters with Lauren's face circulated, with slogans like "We will never forget." But next to her face was Daniel's already socially condemned. The clamor for justice mixed legitimate grief with a thirst for revenge. At the university, his desk was emptied. His books were donated. His name was removed from internal records. No colleague publicly defended him. Some, anonymously, said they didn't believe him but didn't want to risk their careers. The fear of association outweighed the desire to question him. Reputation was a minefield. The national press briefly covered the case. A magazine published an article titled "The Killer Who Read Faulkner." They used excerpts from Daniel's illegally leaked intimate letters. They criticized his vocabulary as pretentious. Even his writing style was used as a basis for conviction. The intimate details were transformed into a piece of public exposure. Over time, Daniel's name became taboo even within his own family. Uncles, cousins, and old neighbors began to avoid them. The surname Scott was no longer spoken aloud. Joan began signing only with her first name. Evan wore a baseball cap and avoided places where they were known. The pain was too public to face. Daniel, from his cell, knew everything. He saw it in the old headlines that reached him. He heard the guards' comments. He knew that, outside, his image was that of a remorseless killer, and the more he thought about it, the more he withdrew. It was as if he were being slowly erased, replaced by a stranger created by the public's hunger for monsters. But in a small Milwaukee apartment, someone was starting to get suspicious of that too-perfect narrative. Riley Thompson lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in a rented studio above a laundromat. A freelance investigative journalist, she spent her days immersed in archives, old tapes, and public reports. That week, she was working on a story about forensic database flaws in the U.S. Her focus was technical until she stumbled upon a name, Daniel Scott. Something about that name caught her attention. Perhaps it coincided with a case that had been dismissed due to genetic inconsistencies. The digital file showed an inconclusive DNA report from 2003, connected to a campus crime in Missouri. Riley pulled up the raw data. There was a partial match to a known profile, but the report had been closed. Due to lack of priority, this bothered her. She decided to investigate. She opened Daniel's complete file. She read every report, every statement, every headline. The feeling was immediate. It didn't make sense. The more I read, the wider the gaps widen. The alleged confession didn't match the crime chronology. The coroner's report contradicted the primary testimony. The forensic team ignored an unidentified blood trace. It was as if the whole thing had been staged to justify a decision already made. Riley knew this pattern. He was an expert in shaky narratives transformed into legal truths. He contacted Evan Scott. He hesitated at first, tired of false promises. But when he heard that Riley didn't want to tell the story of pain, but rather the story of distortion, he agreed. He sent documents, letters from Daniel, old videos, newspaper clippings. Riley spent sleepless nights piecing together the timeline. And with each connection, the case became more absurd. She visited Kansas City 2 weeks later. She walked around the UMKC campus and observed the parking lot where Lauren was killed. She spoke with former employees. One, now retired, said he remembered a rumor about clues that had been shelved. Riley was intrigued. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests to review the original material. She got little, but what she received was enough. In his cell, Daniel received a letter in unfamiliar handwriting. It was from Riley. It said she believed him, that she was reopening the case, that she made no promises, but she wouldn't let the story die in silence. Daniel read the letter several times, for the first time in years. A spark ignited. He wrote back, detailing what he remembered, his feelings, the lapses from the night of his confession. Riley published an article on an independent blog, The Forgotten Librarian. It reported the flaws in the process with technical rigor and empathy. It wasn't sensationalist. It was an indictment. Within days, the article went viral among criminal justice groups. NGOs began commenting. Volunteer lawyers reached out. It was the beginning of something bigger. A reform-minded judge in St. Louis. Read the report. He was known for reviewing old cases. He requested the records. He found too many inconsistencies to ignore. He authorized a preliminary review. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Daniel's case would be officially reevaluated. Riley was present at the hearing. He watched Daniel enter, thinner, but with his chin held high. The prosecution tried to block the reopening, saying the case was closed, but the judge insisted. He ordered the DNA data reanalyzed using new technology. A drop of blood found on the victim's sleeve was compared to the national database. A week later, the results shocked everyone. A partial match to a convicted felon in Arizona. The name, Thomas Rayner, an employee of a contracting company that provided services to the university in 2003. He was arrested years later for attempted rape. He was never investigated in Lauren's case. The failure to compare DNA in 2003 now looked like a serious technical error, an error that cost an innocent man the decades of his life. Riley was called to testify in the new phase of the trial. She recounted the entire journey she had taken, the documents she had crossed, the doors she had knocked on. Her speech was precise but emotional. The court listened in silence. Daniel, seated, watched her with teary eyes. It was as if someone had stepped into the fire only to pull it back out. Evan hugged Riley outside the courthouse. Joan cried softly, her hands on her face. For the first time in 20 years, they weren't alone. Public opinion was beginning to shift. Headlines like "Librarian may have been victim of miscarriage of justice" were appearing. Still timid, still cautious, but it was the beginning of the reconstruction of a buried truth. Riley knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new battle against the system's resistance to admitting its own error. But she was ready, and Daniel, for the first time, was no longer on the margins of his own story. Even with the new evidence, Daniel's path to freedom was fraught with obstacles. The prosecution refused to acknowledge their mistake. They claimed that the presence of other people's DNA at the scene didn't rule out Daniel's involvement. They insinuated that he might have been an accomplice. The arguments changed as needed, but the intention was always the same: to uphold the conviction. The judge responsible for the new review faced internal resistance. Some colleagues pressured him to dismiss the case. Others questioned the impact this would have on the local justice system. Admitting error meant reviewing dozens of other cases, and no one wanted to carry that political weight. Daniel's truth was a risk for many. The state attorney general spoke out publicly, saying that reviewing old convictions could set dangerous precedents. The statement sparked protests from activists, but also support from conservative sectors. Social media was once again divided. Daniel was once again being debated as a symbol, not as a person. His personal drama became a battlefield for ideological warfare. Daniel's new lawyer, a volunteer with the Innocence Project, filed a motion for immediate review of the sentence. He presented 127 pages of evidence of inconsistencies, ignored reports, and the new genetic evidence. The motion was read, but not immediately ruled on. The court cited a backlog of cases. Daniel remained in prison and waiting. The defense requested full access to the original prosecution's documents. Some of them were lost. Another batch was damaged. Interrogation records had edited sections. Videos were incomplete. What was once a rush turned into institutional amnesia. Every attempt to access the truth met with half-open doors. The bureaucracy revealed itself to be complicit. It took 6 months of waiting for a new hearing. During that time, Daniel suffered 3 anxiety attacks. He was taken to the infirmary twice. With each news of a postponement, his body shrank. Time, already stolen, continued to be stolen. Riley documented everything. He recorded videos, interviewed experts, and lobbied on social media. The case gained national attention. Investigative journalism programs began covering the story. With the exposure came new pressure, including from politicians. Some demanded answers, others defended the system. A Missouri senator even said, "If we start releasing criminals on technical issues, where will we end up?" Daniel's response came in an open letter published in an independent newspaper. "Where will we end up?" He wrote, "If we continue to convict innocent people for convenience's sake." The text moved many, but it also generated hatred. Some families of real-life crime victims began attacking him, as if his innocence were an affront to their pain. Evan traveled constantly to meetings with lawyers and hearings. He sold everything he could to cover his expenses. Joan no longer left the house. She was afraid of being approached, but he maintained a routine of prayer and writing. He wrote to Daniel every day, even without knowing if the letters would arrive. It was the only way to maintain his faith. The prosecution, cornered, tried to cut a deal. They suggested probation in exchange for Daniel maintaining his guilt. It was a coup disguised as generosity. He refused. He said he'd rather die in prison than carry a fabricated guilt. It was the only time he shouted in court, "I didn't do it, and I won't sign what I didn't do." This reaction caused a stir. For the first time, some in the press changed their tune. Headlines appeared, "Innocent. Man refuses partial release to maintain integrity." The public was beginning to see the full extent of the absurdity. Daniel's silence was now replaced by courage. He didn't just want to leave. He wanted complete justice. A second judge, after a preliminary review, ruled in favor of reopening the case in full. He ordered a new hearing, but the state prosecutor appealed. The battle turned into a legal battle, appeals, counter-appeals, and injunctions. Daniel became a symbol of a struggle between justice and institutional pride. It was a man against a machine. Riley organized vigils outside the courthouse with signs, "Justice for Daniel, free the truth." Young people, activists, and teachers attended. For the first time, Daniel had allies beyond his family, but resistance remained strong. The slow-moving, self-protective American legal system was reluctant to budge. Each victory was followed by a new obstacle. It was like running on a treadmill. So much effort, so little progress. Daniel felt time slipping away like sand through his fingers, but something kept him going. Now his story was known, and the lie was beginning to crumble. It was on a gray November day that everything changed. An intern at the Innocence Project, sifting through old files of unidentified DNA, discovered an indexing error. A sample from the crime scene had been registered with the wrong code. Therefore, it was never compared with the updated national database. It was a bureaucratic oversight, almost invisible, but its impact would be immense. For the first time, a glimmer of truth, long overlooked, emerged. With a new, corrected code, the sample was entered into the system. The result came back within 3 days. There was a match. Thomas Rayner, a former UMKC campus maintenance worker. He had been convicted in 2009 of attempted rape in another state. His DNA was now in the records, and it matched the blood found on the victim's sleeve. It was a direct, concrete, definitive connection. The revelation fell like a bombshell on the defense team. It was the kind of evidence that couldn't be ignored. The prosecution tried to downplay it. It could be contamination or casual presence. But experts asserted that the amount of blood indicated direct, violent contact. Thomas Rayner was never mentioned in the case, never questioned, never even listed as a possible suspect. Riley published the news in an article titled, "The Forgotten DNA That Could Free Daniel Scott." The story spread quickly. Major newspapers began to pick up on it. Thomas Rayner's name made headlines. People remembered him on campus in 2003. He worked nights, patrolling in dimly lit areas, a loner with a history of aggression, and no one had connected him to Lauren's death. The defense filed a request for an emergency hearing. For the first time, the judge summoned the prosecutors to explain why this evidence was never considered. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. The state's attorneys were nervous. They tried to argue technological limitations of the time, but the judge dismissed it. He said that administrative errors cannot justify wrongful arrests. During the hearing, the forensic technician responsible for the database was called. He admitted that the indexing failure was due to human error. He said that, at the time, there was no effective cross-checking and that many cases could have been affected by this. It was a public confession of a systemic failure. Daniel, listening in silence, felt his heart pound like it hadn't in a long time. The defense also managed to locate a witness who lived on campus in 2003. A now retired janitor remembered seeing Rayner in the parking lot that night. He said the man seemed nervous, sweaty, and had a torn shirt. He didn't speak at the time because no one called him. He thought it wasn't important. Now, his memory gained weight. With the new genetic evidence and testimony, the prosecution began to backtrack. For the first time, it publicly admitted that there could be flaws in the case. But it didn't request an immediate dismissal. It wanted more time. The strategy was clear: minimize damage, save reputations. But external pressure was growing. Daniel's case was taking on the contours of a national scandal. The media changed its tone. Programs that had previously called him a monster now called him a possible victim of the system. Opinion pieces abounded. How many Daniels are still in prison when justice fails? Who pays the price? Daniel's name was finally rehabilitated, but the damage was already done, and the pain wasn't erased by favorable headlines. Joan heard the news on TV. She cried, fell to her knees, and called Evan, shouting, "The DNA, Evan, the DNA." For the first time, she felt the world recognize what she had always known. Her son was innocent, and now she had proof. The hope that had seemed buried had resurfaced. With strength, with a body, with a name and surname, Daniel, in prison, received the news in silence. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He simply closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cold wall of his cell. After 20 years of being called a liar, someone was finally telling the truth for him. But there was still a trial to come, and justice, even with the truth in its hands, still hesitated to release him. The judge scheduled the final hearing for the following week. It would be the time to review the entire conviction, the new evidence, the old mistakes, the forgotten testimonies. It was the climax of a battle that began with an arbitrary arrest and dragged on for 2 decades. Daniel would be heard again, but this time, with the country watching, the prosecutor's office, cornered, had no other way to deny anything. They began talking about collective responsibility. They used vague terms like a flawed system, external pressures, and lack of technology. No one admitted direct guilt, but the veiled admission was already a step Daniel could never have taken alone. Riley went to the prison to visit him the day before the hearing. For the first time, they met in person. She said nothing. She just held out her hand. Daniel took it, and there, in a silent squeeze, the worlds met, that of buried truth and the courage to unearth it. The Missouri courthouse, packed that morning, was filled with a dense silence. Cameras from local and national news outlets filled every corner. Reporters murmured in the lines. Joan held her eldest son's hand. Evan sweated from his palms, and Daniel, in a beige uniform with graying hair, entered under escort. But his step was firm. After 20 years, the stage of grief was also the stage of hope. The judge, a man with an austere expression, opened the hearing promptly. He read the case's motivations, the new evidence, and the history of inconsistencies. With each sentence, Daniel's face remained expressionless. It wasn't indifference, it was exhaustion. Behind him, lawyers, activists, journalists. In front, a system that pretended to listen again, but now there was nowhere to hide. The prosecutor began his speech. He acknowledged flaws in the investigative process, unintentional errors, and technological limitations at the time. He avoided the word fault. He preferred mistake. He said the state deeply regretted the suffering caused. Daniel didn't react, because it all sounded like a practiced excuse. None of it would make up for lost time. The defense, for its part, was precise. It presented the final DNA report. The new testimony, the interrogation errors, the forced confession, the inconsistent chronology. It reread excerpts from the 2003 trial, comparing them with current facts. It exposed the legal absurdity. The audience listened in silence, interrupted only by suppressed sighs. The judge shook his head slowly. When Daniel was called to speak, he hesitated. He stood up, looked around, and took a deep breath. He simply said, "I've waited 20 years to hear that you believe me. I have no speech. I just want my life back." The room fell silent. It was a simple sentence, but it carried everything he hadn't been able to say for 2 decades. He didn't apologize. He didn't plead. He was simply truthful. The judge called a brief recess. The courtroom emptied into murmurs. Outside, protesters held signs. "Justice for Daniel. It's not enough to release him. We must repair him." The press updated websites in real time. Hashtags with his name were among the most talked about topics. The city that had forgotten him now wanted to see him free. When the judge returned, his voice was firm. He declared the original sentence null and void due to serious underlying defect. He ordered Daniel Scott's immediate release. There was a collective sigh. Joan burst into tears, hugging her eldest son. Evan threw himself over Daniel, still handcuffed, and wept as if bringing someone back to life. Daniel simply closed his eyes. He felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The handcuffs were removed in the center of the room, a symbolic gesture, slow, definitive. Daniel looked at his hands. They felt like another man's. They were trembling, thin, marked by years of neglect, but they were free for the first time. Since 2003, he walked without chains. The sound of the door opening was no longer that of a cell, it was that of an exit. Outside, flashes, shouts, microphones. Daniel didn't speak. He just raised his head. He looked up at the cloudy sky like someone gasping for air after a long drowning. Riley appeared in the crowd. He waved. No words were spoken between them at that moment, but everything was said in their eyes. The truth, finally, had shouted. Louder, the press broadcast live. Daniel Scott, freed after 20 years of unjust imprisonment. Analysts tried to explain. Politicians rehearsed speeches, but the reality was harsher than any words. A man had been ripped from his time, his youth, his dignity, and now he was back, older, tougher, quieter, but still standing. On the way home, Daniel remained quiet. Joan wouldn't let go of his hand. Evan drove with shaking hands. When they reached the door of the house where it all began, Daniel hesitated. It was the same house, the same sidewalk, but nothing was the same. He took a deep breath. You took the first step, and then, finally, he cried. He cried like he'd never cried before. That night, he slept for the first time, without the sound of iron doors, no lights turning on every hour, without the fear of breathing loudly. He slept between the old sheets of his childhood, embraced by a mother who never doubted. The silence was different now. It wasn't a fear. It was a relief. It was a freedom. But not every liberation brings immediate peace. Lost time cannot be regained. Scars don't disappear with applause. The trauma, even acknowledged, lingers, and Daniel knew this. He knew the nightmare didn't end with release. It merely changed form. During his first days of freedom, Daniel hardly left his room. The brightness was uncomfortable. The sounds of the street frightened him. Every doorbell was a shock, every tap on his shoulder, a defensive reflex. His mind was still locked, even though his body could walk. Freedom, for him, was new territory and strange. Readjustment would be slow and painful. Joan tried to cook his favorite meals, but Daniel ate little. He said he wasn't hungry. The taste of things seemed different, weaker. He constantly glanced at the clock as if waiting for something. Sometimes he asked the time unnecessarily. It was a prison habit, the habit of someone who counted the meaningless minutes. Time was still his enemy. Sleeping was the biggest challenge. The nightmares returned frequently. The bedroom walls seemed to close in during the early hours. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him sit up in bed, sweating. Joan placed a chair by the door, as if to calm him. Evan suggested seeking therapy. Daniel hesitated, then agreed, but he said little in the sessions. The first time he went to the supermarket, Daniel froze. He saw too many people, too much noise, too much stimulation. The checkout line panicked him. He dropped his items and ran out. In the car, he cried silently. He felt ashamed. He felt He was no longer capable of living in the world. The world had moved on, and he was frozen in 2003. Old friends tried to reconnect, some sincerely, others out of curiosity. Daniel refused to meet. He preferred silence. He received letters of support, messages from strangers, tributes on social media. He read some. He ignored most. He couldn't handle so much attention. He'd spent so much time being ignored that the sudden affection seemed suspicious. The house seemed smaller now. The rooms held memories. The living room, the couch where Evan slept, the kitchen where he'd had coffee before prison, the bedroom where dusty books still hung. Daniel spent hours rereading old notes. He wanted to remember who he'd been. He wanted to see the young man who wore sweaters and loved film noir again. The first time he watched a movie in freedom, he turned it off halfway through. It was a police thriller. At one point, the character's interrogation made him freeze. He got up and went to the backyard. He stood there, staring at the wind. Evan appeared, but said nothing. He just stood nearby. Their silence spoke louder than any words. Riley stayed in touch. She called frequently, texted, and asked how he was doing. Daniel responded with short but sincere sentences. One day, he wrote, "I'm still trying to exist." She understood. She knew starting over was harder than surviving. She arranged a visit, and they had coffee together on the porch. It was a moment of respite. Daniel began writing. Short texts, reflections, fragments. It was his way of reconstructing his voice. He wrote about time, about invisible bars, about stolen words. He published an article in a criminal justice journal. He received praise. He was invited to lecture. He turned them all down. He still didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted to be. Joan returned to her old habits. She planted flowers in the yard, sewed pillows, wrote in her journal, but now her writing had a different tone, of relief, of lingering pain, but with light. She would say, "Daniel is back, but he's not the same anymore, and that's okay." She learned to love her son again, in his new form, without rushing, without expectations. Evan returned to work, but with a reduced workload. He dedicated part of his days to caring for his brother. He made a point of taking Daniel on walks, therapy sessions, and appointments. Their relationship became even stronger, a brotherhood shaped by pain, struggle, and persistence, a bond that time could not break. Daniel began to talk more in therapy, little by little. He talked about the sounds of the cell, the light that never went out, the smell of concrete. He spoke of anger, sadness, fear, but he also spoke of hope. He said that one day he wanted to visit a library again, touch books, smell paper, return to the place where it all began and was lost. The state offered compensation, millions in dollars. Joan wept. Evan remained silent. Daniel refused the first amount. He said he didn't want money, he wanted recognition. He wanted the heir to be admitted in no uncertain terms. He wanted other cases to be reviewed. Justice, for him, wasn't about money. It was about memory, reparation, and truth. Some newspapers tried to profit from his story. They offered exclusive interviews, documentaries, series. Daniel refused. He said that if he were to tell the story, he would tell it his way, and maybe one day he would. But not now. Now was the time for silence, for rebuilding, for relearning how to walk without constantly looking back. But even in freedom, Daniel knew something was still loose. An unanswered question, a face still hidden in the shadows. With Daniel's release, the inevitable question resurfaced. Who killed Lauren Price? Thomas Rayner's DNA was at the scene, but he had never been formally charged. The police said they were reevaluating the case. The prosecution, silent, avoided comment. It was as if everyone wanted the matter to disappear, but the ghost of that crime lived on. Thomas Rayner had been arrested for similar crimes, but in other states. His record included assaults, attempted assaults, and a history of domestic violence. Yet, he had never been linked to Lauren's murder. When the press tried to speak to him, the lawyers responded with a curt note. Our client will not be making a statement. The silence was deafening. Lauren's devastated family was divided. Her mother demanded answers. She wanted to know why Rayner was never investigated, why they ignored the threatening messages on her daughter's cell phone, why they followed such a fragile path and abandoned real leads. Her father, meanwhile, completely withdrew from the press. He wouldn't give interviews. He simply visited his daughter's grave every month, in silence for 20 years. He carried a dirty reputation, a face glued to a crime he didn't commit, a life suspended in cells, false reports, and broken promises. He was invisible when he asked for help, and he made headlines when he served as a villain. The truth only emerged when someone decided to dig into the silence, and when it did, it was too late to give back everything that had been taken from him. Daniel's story exposes a system that prefers to appear right rather than be just, a system that listens too quickly to those who accuse, and too slowly to those who demand attention, that files away evidence, manipulates versions, and hesitates to admit mistakes, and when it does, it destroys not just the body, but time, the mind, ties, and the name. Lauren Price remains without full justice. Her family remains without a real answer. And Thomas Rayner remains free. The state, so quick to judge, now proves too slow to make amends. As if apologies were enough, as if millions in compensation could erase 20 years of oblivion. How many more lives will justice miss before something changes? How many innocent people still live behind locked doors because of mistakes that no one wants to correct? And if that happened to you, what would you do?